Good evening and welcome to this event of CIC. Today we have a book launch. The book titled Kautilyanomics. We have the authors Sri Ram Balasubramaniam. He is a well-known economist and author. His areas of interest include global macroeconomics, socio-economic trends in emerging markets, and Indic dharmic culture. He has written for several international publications such as Bloomberg, Foreign Policy, the Wall Street Journal, and Vox EU, among others, as an independent columnist and has been an independent panelist on CNBC TV Live 18. He has authored two books, Jamba, The Joint Family, which was shortlisted for the third annual IAAC Literary Festival organized by the Indo-American Arts Council, and The Wizards, which has been featured in various publications including The Hindu. He is an alumnus of Columbia University in New York. He lives in Washington, D.C., Maryland, in USA. Welcome. Welcome, Sriram. Please join us on the dais. Joining the panel discussion is Sri Rajiv Lochan. Rajiv is currently Managing Director of Sundaram Finance. Prior to Sundaram Finance, Rajiv was the Managing Director and Chief Executive Officer of the Hindu Group. In addition, Rajiv serves as an independent director on the boards of Lifestyle India Private Limited, Calidofin, a fintech company with a mission to propel the underbanked and bottom of the pyramid customers. Rajiv also serves on the board of management of Kriya University, a higher education institution focused on liberal arts and management education. Prior to his current assignment, Rajiv was a partner with McKinsey & Company, where he primarily served institutions in the financial sector. Before that, Rajiv worked at American Express Company in New York in the risk management team. Rajiv holds a Bachelor of Technology degree in Civil Engineering from IIT Madras, a Master of Science in Transportation degree from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, Cambridge, and an MBA degree from the Columbia Business School, New York. He lives in Chennai with his wife, Professor Preeti Agalyam, a professor of chemical engineering at IIT Madras. Please join us on the dais, Rajiv. The third panelist of today is Mr. Balasubramaniam. He is the Managing Director and Chief Executive Officer of Aditya Birla Sun Life AMC Limited. He has been associated with the organization since 1994, and prior to assuming the role of CEO in 2009, Mr. Balasubramaniam served as Chief Investment Officer from 2006 to 2009. As MD and CEO, he oversees over 3 lakh crore in assets under management at Aditya Birla Sun Life AMC. He has been awarded the CEO of the Year title by Asia Asset Management in 2018 and 2020. He has been awarded Chairman's Individual Award by the Aditya Birla Group for being an outstanding leader in 2015 and being a leader of leaders in 2018. He is associated with key industry bodies. He has been on the board of AMFI and was the Vice President of AMFI. From 16 to 18, he was the Chairman of AMFI. He has been reappointed as Chairman of AMFI in 2021. He is also Governor on the Board of Governors of National Institute of Securities Markets and a member of the Advisory Committee of the SEBI, Investor Protection and Education Fund. Welcome, Mr. Balasubramaniam. Please join us. We will start this session. I invite Mr. Gopal Srinivasan to join us on the dais. We will first have the book launch. I request the author, Sri Ram, to please hand over the first copy of the book to Gopal. You can unwrap. You can unwrap. let's take this opportunity of wishing the author all the best for this publication and many more to come. I now request Gopal to give us a few words before he leaves the dais.
No, I think it's a very special privilege for us to have this book launch here. I think the amount of work that has to be done on our own traditions, our own intellectual quest for how to govern and how to govern the economy, as well as not just the nation and the defense, as Sriram has spoken about, is something I'm looking forward to. So I don't want to stand between you and the program today, but I was just so delighted when I met him and we had a brief interaction just before this, to just see his own story of how he discovered this book and what it meant. So I'm actually looking forward to him sharing that with you and hopefully throwing in my 2 questions. So Sriram, thank you very much, and thank you, Mr. Balasubramanian, for coming here. Rajiv, of course, is Chennai's own, so I'm very happy that he's anchoring this discussion. Let's get on with the discussion.
Thank you, Gopal. Now, without waiting for further, I hand over the proceedings to Sriram. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, everyone, for CIC for organizing this event. Rajiv, thanks for coming. Mr. Balasubramanian as well. He's come all the way from Mumbai just for this event. I would like to also thank Dr. Vaidya. He's not here, I think, but he helped us sort of put together this event. Before I start, I want to also dedicate this event to late Sri S. Vishwanathan from the Industrial Economist magazine. SV, as I think a lot of the CIC audience are aware, was a mentor of mine. He gave me the first opportunity to write almost 10 or even 12, 13 years ago. And I wish he was here. So he was someone I truly miss. So I would like to dedicate this to him. And of course, a book is a teamwork. It's a huge exercise. My wife, I would like to thank her because we just had a 1-year-old child. So I've been completely working on the book and the book related to hers. And without the support of the family, it's impossible to do these things. So I thought of mentioning that to my parents as well, and to everyone who supported me. So Kautilya's Arthashastra is a fascinating text. It's about 1,500 slokas. It's about 15 books and numerous chapters. I chanced upon this by chance when I was working on sort of a research project as part of my professional work on Angus Maddison. Angus Maddison is a world-renowned economic historian. So he had produced a data set in economic parlance of GDP and GDP per capita data for about 1,000 years, from 0C onwards all the way till 17th century. And that shows that India and China were one of the top 2 countries in terms of GDP and GDP per capita during that time frame. So my intuitive understanding was that there had to be some sort of an economic framework, some financial or an economic framework that facilitated this growth. I mean, if we have, for example, the Brihadiswara temple in Tanjavur, such a complex sort of engineering marvel that can be done, I was pretty sure that they understood some basic economics as well, because without that, understanding complex engineering becomes an arduous ask. So that's how the quest for the Arthashastra began. So what I try to do, I try to answer 3 big questions. The first question is, what is the role of civilizational thinking in our economic policy framing or economic policy thinking? We talk a lot about Atmanirbharta and things like that. But my personal view is that there's a lot of successful civilizations or kingdoms over the last 1,000, 1,500 years, but very little has been sort of understood on how their economic financial models were. So this attempt for this book is to sort of, through the Arthashastra, which is a 3rd century BCE text, lay out a framework for people to sort of understand or at least come to terms with what such a framework could be for policy making. And because I believe that whether it is capitalism in today's age, which is probably an offshoot of a Protestant ethic, or the Chinese economic models, or even the Japanese economic models, all of them have a civilizational underpinning. They're inspired somewhere through a civilizational sort of inspiration. So, at least in our case, in India's case, I don't see that in many cases. Either we don't have enough knowledge about what has happened in the past, or we don't do enough rigor to sort of understand this. So, this book tries to attempt that as a first sort of a goal, to get Kautilya's Arthashastra and then showcasing it in a way which has an analytical rigor to it. And the second thing is okay, now that we know that there had to be some sort of a philosophy, and you know that there's a successful sort of enterprise or kingdom, what is the framework that they had? So that's where I bring this idea of dharmic capitalism into the book, which is, in my view, Kautilya's sort of Kautilya's thrust or underpinning in the entire Arthashastra. So Kautilya basically believes that the role of dharma, I mean, we all discuss dharma day in and day out, there are thousands of meanings, but in this particular case, I have defined it through the prism of ethics, responsibilities, and sort of global harmony. These were three pillars which Kautilya used for his governance. So basically, in any sort of economic policy, in very simple terms, you either intervene at the state, meaning the state, the government, increases taxes, or it builds infrastructure, or it does a wide variety of things, or you deal it with the market. The market makes changes, and that affects economic activity. So Kautilya basically believed that the role of dharma could be the self-correcting mechanism both for the state and the market. So I introduced this theory of dharmic capitalism in the book, and that is mapped to his idea of wealth creation. He was one of the earliest thinkers to actually talk about creation of wealth. The Arthashastra, the focus itself, the Artha part of it, which is basically wealth creation. So wealth creation was not a taboo in this land for thousands of years. So, and the ability to have international trade, an international sort of an approach to wealth creation, and also a state which is strong but doesn't intervene too much at the micro level. So, the second part of it is laying the framework. Because of the fact that there's very little literature on the subject, there had to be a lot of work to sort of get this framework, as a concept. And then, what do you do the framework? Because you need to contextualize it today's times so that it's useful for students and useful for, academics and useful for policymakers. So what I attempt to do is, in each of the chapters, I sort of go into how is it relevant in today's times. So for example, there's a chapter on trade. We talk about trade in Kautilya's times and trade in today's times. And then I also gave a sort of a Kautilyan Tantra, which is something that, that gives you Kautilya's ideas and how it's relevant today. So the relevance part of it is the next sort of big bucket in terms of trade. An example is trade. So the same thing there's another chapter on inequality and things like that. So each chapter sort of goes back and forth. And at the end of it, I try to summarize everything, through this framework. But just to, sort of conclude this section, I think the main purpose of the book is to create an awareness. One, among the students, and I'm glad quite a few students are here, and two, among the CIC audience. I mean, business people, policymakers, to sort of, get this almost in their face, to tell them, listen, this is a topic that needs to be debated, that needs to be discussed. There might be various versions of this, but it's really, it's impossible to think that a text which is so much talked about, but there is very, very little literature on the subject related to economics and finance. So this is an attempt to get people to engage, debate, discuss, and probably produce 10 more books like this, so that, years down the line, we have, an idea of, first of all, how our civilizational underpinning has guided us, and how some of these ideas can be used in today's times. So with that, I conclude this part of the introduction. Go to Rajiv next.
Thanks, Sriram, for inviting me to be part of the book launch function. So, of course, Vaidi from Sastra University called me and said, well, I wanted to be there. Of course, I cannot say no to him. And again, glad I came here. I could meet everyone who have been the driver of the economy. So I just went through the book very glance. Of course, I've been traveling. Then I said, let me just glance through the book. I think taking back the memories that how the Indian federal system used to function in the early days, and the Chanakya Sastra, which all of us admire, but a day-to-day basis when we follow, we may not know actually it's derived from the Chanakya Sastra. So that's something I could get a sense from your book. And second, when I was reading few chapters, I think you have gone extensively to quote Rudram, Chamakam, and Rigvedas and other things. Now, all of us, of course, used to chant these things in our own way, but many times we do not know what to chant. But we do, of course, chant. I think you have brought in very interestingly some of the insight related to the business, related to the economy, and how the economy was run in the early days, and how it's actually being run today. But in fact, as I kept going through some of the pages, I could relate what are the things that currently we are trying to do as an economy, Indian economy. The first and foremost, which you have highlighted, the social welfare is something is repeatedly mentioned about this. And today, if you ask me, India is exactly doing the same thing what maybe you would have advocated many years back, and in their own ways, like how you took the name of Japan. There was a economic which is called Abenomics. So there is a theme called Abenomics, which of course is no more, he was shot dead about few months back. But there's an Abenomics, which is nothing but inviting, not trouble, but inviting inflation. So in a country which has gone through absolutely no price increase, and therefore companies are suffering, there's no price increase. Then there was a need being felt by Abenomics that Japan has to now pray to the God that inflation comes back. Of course, today all of us are worried about the inflation, but the fact of the matter is the same. The economic theory was applied in a different way, the form of Abenomics. So, I think when I look at it from India point of view, there's a lot of relationship. I'm saying it in the current regime. One, with respect to the social welfare, is being advocated quite aggressively. Second, of course, very interestingly, I've given the chart. I just noted down some of the things that I'm able to relate. Is about the importance of dharmic capitalism. I think I've repeatedly mentioned about dharmic capitalism. As you rightly put, all of us use this word very easily on a day-to-day basis, probably without knowing deep about how it's going to have an impact. The one such example probably I would like to highlight, the dharmic capitalism, I see actually how the money is being distributed for purpose of building the business. That's one way I look at it. Today, if you ask me, that most of the companies who operate in India, they do ask a question about what is the source of financing and how source is going to be allocated for building the business. Any wrong source of allocation or wrong allocation of sources, if it happens, the punishment is also equally high. So I think you mentioned about ethics and the way one does it. And naturally, it has a huge impact in today's world. And one such scheme which the government of India itself used to drive, I still remember this again, it was the old system which we call it as a Mahatma Gandhi Nariga scheme. And it's a scheme, very good schemes, no doubt. It actually increased the employment probability of the country so that more people can get employed in order to meet their basic needs. But the question is how the money is being utilized the right way, or there is a middleman actually takes away the money, therefore the element of ethics comes under the question mark. The scheme was powerful. But given the fact that the scheme is very good but is not creating the right impact, the government of India came and actually changed the whole model, saying Nariga scheme will not be used actually for the purpose of giving employment. And for the road construction worker, it will be given only for the people who actually build water resource management in the country. So, Jaikin, you have very rightly mentioned about building a sustainable business model for any country to progress, which again, the old principles, which is what is being followed in the olden days, as part of the Chanakya principles, it seems to be now coming back in India today, where sustainable business model. Creating a wealth is something not many talk about. I think it seems to be one of the old way of saying like currency versus coins. Those days coins are being used, today is the currency. Now currency also now is gone, is now coming the digital today. But the fact of the matter is the concept remains the same. And the third again, which I think seems to be highlighting is actually any business that you do, there has to be some kind of price element. I think you have gone about mentioning about price fixing and MRP, you are given a reference to the MRP. But when I actually look back and then see actually how the whole pricing model used to exist, even today the pricing model exists. Clearly, there is a connection between how the MRP prices and how business has to be run in a profitable manner. We cannot just do everything free. There has to be some element of profit element in order to actually make the economy progress. I think you have beautifully stitched each of these concepts derived from various the Itikas or maybe the Arthasastra, and then link it to the real economic, which all of us, of course, feel it, see it, do it, but not necessarily we connect actually to the history and basis which I think we learn. But definitely, I think your book has brought about. In fact, initially I thought let me just glance through, and when I was glancing through, I said I am not doing a justice and glancing through, but I have to do a justice by reading each and every line. That's the way I actually went deeper. And of course, I still have to cover more pages. And thanks for bringing out this book. And I'm sure this is going to add a lot of value. Maybe I would also probably encourage, there is also merit to bring Modinomics on the basis of Abenomics, as I mentioned. There is a merit to have Modinomics, because Modinomics is exactly talks about, without he quoting Arthasastra or the Chanakya principle, the way each and every step that the government is taking today are more or less in line with what is being advocated by Chanakya Sastra. Therefore, I'm sure you may actually, the way I think you have also engaged with the government officials, there may be a scenario where you'll also write about Modinomics in the next few years to come. With this, thanks for making me part of this session today.
Thank you, Bala. Good evening, everyone. I'll start by thanking CIC for thinking of me and having me as part of this wonderful book launch event, and thank you, Sriram, for the opportunity. I also want to give a shout out to the students from PSBV. I hope they've not been dragged here, but have come quite happily. I'm a proud alumnus of the school. And if I candidly recall some events, I would be forced to go, but most events I went quite happily, and I hope you're here taking notes and will write the next chapter or the next book following in Sriram's footsteps. I read the book and it was quite an instructive read. I read it with three levels in mind. One, as someone running an organization, what are the learnings, what are the takeaways? Am I able to correlate the core thesis with what I see? And here I've, in my nearly 30-year career now, I've only worked with 100+ year companies. It's not by choice, but just by accident. And so there are lots of things that enduring organizations have done, which I could connect back with the core thesis of dharmic capitalism that Sriram has put forth. The second lens I took was of a community, like say a Chennai or a Tamil Nadu. What are the implications for a community that folks like us are part of and can contribute to? What are lessons, takeaways, things that we should consider? And the third was, of course, from a national vantage point, what are the implications to India on the cusp of regaining her position in the world stage, taking off and becoming a superpower over the next 15, 20, 25 years. What are some things from the past that we may have to bring back and embed? Those were the three perspectives with which I looked. I'll start off with the first one because that seems easiest and simplest to articulate. The two or three underpinnings of dharmic capitalism, the way Sriram is framed, is the first one around the notion of dharma itself. And to me, the organizations I've been associated with have a very strong sense of purpose. And it's certainly not the profit maximization motive which most of the Anglo-Saxon sort of theory tends to propound, that the aim of a business is to maximize profits. That's not how at least organizations I've been associated with have approached. There's a deep sense of purpose. There is the sense of a dharma that I have to fulfill. And almost in doing my duty, don't worry so much about the fruit. This notion of nispala karma. And so that to me is the underpinning of the dharmic capitalism that buttresses everything else that you build on top of it. The second layer that Sriram weaves in, which resonated, was this notion of a ethical and harmonious approach. And so when I relate back to the Hindus' code of editorial values or the Sundaram way, which are the 9 values that underpin how we work, the premise is one of ensuring that we create value to stakeholders we touch and do it in a way that allows us to follow the right path, and in the process we get a good night's sleep. So I think this notion of being ethical and harmonious, which is another important layer that Sriram articulates, I can resonate quite well. The third important layer he brings in is, the captain or the leader or leaders have to create a rules-based but non-interventionist approach to administration. And I mean, of course, he frames it in the context of the Arthashastra and running of a kingdom. But in my view, as I think about my own leadership team, the board, and so forth in today's context, they have to lay a set of rules. Part of the rules are defined by the organization itself. Some are defined by the regulators who regulate, supervise us. But those rules have to be clear. But once those rules are laid out, the ask of the organization is to ethically and harmoniously execute against those rules. But equally, leadership needs to, in a sense, not intervene on a day-to-day basis. Let the organization guide itself. And when I think about the editorial independence and freedom that the journalists at the Hindu enjoy, or the space and empowerment that our branch managers and territory managers who undertake the credit underwriting enjoy, I'm able to relate very nicely. Rules are there, but senior leadership and the board doesn't get into, sort of the enforcement of the rules, and of course we oversee and we supervise, but we are non-interventionist in that sense. So that also resonated quite well. The third argument that Sriram makes is wealth creation is at the core of doing good. And I think we have a long history of that actually. Although I think the period of a few decades of socialism has made this notion of wealth creation seem like a bad thing. In reality, creating value for folks that we interact with and doing good for the communities we operate in is at the core of who we are, and that's why I think we've been a civilizational state. It seems to me that in the last few decades, somehow, enterprise, entrepreneurship, and wealth creation has been seen with a little bit of a colored lens, almost as something that needs to be scorned upon. Whereas I'm of the firm view that if I look at an enterprise, its primary focus is to do good to the society, but at the same time create value so that you could reinvest into the business. And to me, the cleanest illustration of this was at the Hindu, where for almost 25 to 30 years, the Hindu actually owned 4 aircraft. And I don't know if people are aware of this, but 4 aircraft were owned by a newspaper company with the only reason to deliver newspapers to far-flung places. And that was such a sagacious choice that was made by the owners and the editorial leadership to get the voice of public opinion to reach far-flung corners of southern India during that time. But think about it, can you imagine a newspaper company owning aircraft to deliver newspapers? Today it's done on the back of bicycles and maybe mopeds. But that's what the wealth creation could do. It was channelized in a very noble way, as opposed to necessarily in a greedy way. So this wealth creation point that Sriram emphasizes, I can resonate with. And the last point he makes is around focus on sustainable growth and focused on welfare of the stakeholders that you operate. And again, organizations have been associated that are long-standing, don't focus on themselves. They focus on the stakeholders, whether it's a delivery boy at the Hindu or the branch manager and the dealer at Sundaram Finance. You take care of all the stakeholders and make sure that they do well. Automatically, you end up doing well. So these 4 elements of dharmic capitalism that Sriram has articulated, I think resonate quite deeply from a corporate leadership standpoint. I must confess that there are a couple of areas where he's provoked thinking in me, and there are a couple of areas where I likely disagree with him. But he would argue that's actually victory, because that's what he wants to stir, right? He wants all of us to start to think and debate and discuss. So thanks for all the hard work, Sriram, in bringing this out. I found it an instructive read. But I do want to flick it back to you and get you to talk a little bit to us about the journey itself. Because I think the young folks in the room, but also folks that are policymakers, business leaders in the room would love to understand what it actually took. So take us back, unpeel a few layers and tell us what the journey was like for you and where you have personally shifted perhaps in your own thought process as a result of going through this journey.
Sure, thank you. Yeah, I think that's an interesting question in the sense that I can sort of split the journey into a couple of areas. First is the process of writing such a book, right? generally when you deal with, say, historical subjects, there is background material available. Meaning someone would have written some book about it, and different people would have had different opinions about a particular subject. So then there is a consensus, say, on what the subject is. In this particular case, I mean, the Arthashastra in general, for all the talk on Chanakya, Chanakya Niti, and all these things, there are just about 4 translations available. So there's one translation, I mean, Shama Sastri put it as a book in 1915, and then there is a translation by Kangale, the three versions in 1960, and there's one by Rangarajan in 1990. That's probably the earliest version, put it that way. And these are all by mostly Indologists or people who are, say, Sanskritam experts who try to translate a subject. Whereas the Arthashastra itself is a very dense sort of text which goes across various areas, meaning it talks about law and order, it talks about governance, it talks about defense, all with the underpinning of the economy somewhere around, weaved around. So you required a set of skill sets, for the book. First, you needed people to engage with Sanskritam scholars, probably, develop your own Sanskritam a bit more, and then extract whatever, say, from the text which is relevant. And then as, say, an economist / financial thinker, I, sort of need to weave a framework based on Kautilya's thinking, which again is something innovative because Kautilya doesn't really tell you what his framework is. He just gives you an output, meaning he just, in the text, you just see these are the prescriptions or these are the sort of poetic nuances mentioned. So you have to derive a framework, again, consistent ideas, consistent themes in the text, and then weave something out of it. So that is the second challenge. The third challenge is, of course, dealing with how do you contextualize it in today's times, right? You've done the first 2 parts, but if it's not relevant today, none of you are going to read it. So I had to sort of, try to relate it to how irrelevant it is for today's times, which means look at current trends, look at some of the current gaps that we see in our economy, in our society, and then based on these current trends and gaps, see where Kautilya's ideas can add value. So in that sense, what I'm trying to say is that you need a set of 3 buckets of skill sets to actually write this book. And that's why it took me such a long time. And the lack of literature also further added to this. So it's sort of there's one very good book by Balbir Sihag, who's a PhD from MIT, who's an academic book, who's written on economics of Kautilya. So in terms of, it's a completely academic book. But I wanted this book to also resonate to common people. So this book's target audience is again varied. One is the Indological / academic folks who are involved in the subject. Another is the financial / economic person, and the third one is a common person, who's just open to this. Students who are probably doing 10th or 11th standard, and they are just exploring ideas in economics to sort of get them a flavor that there was a person, say, 1,000 years ago in this land who had ideas which were on par, if not, in some cases, even better than what we talk about today. In fact, Balbir's book talks a lot about how Kautilya is far ahead of Adam Smith in a lot of these ideas. So I don't go too much into this book, but on that subject. But this is also a sort of an undercurrent, a theme that I find more and more. So basically, I think the process, as what Rajiv mentioned, or based on his question, I think the process took me such a long time because of the skill sets required. So eventually, another point which I want to mention is that I think people tend to dilute this kind of content to make it oversimplified. But I think our audiences have reached a point where, we are exposed to so much content, so much technology that people want complex content. It's just that they want rigorous, in a rigorous way. So in that sense, I sort of, a lot of publishers wanted to dilute it. I sort of pushed back on that. But I think that's to good effect because the book is doing really well. And I think audiences nowadays like complex content. So this is probably a quick answer to the question.
And is this, in a sense, a milestone you've hit, or is this just the start of a deeper and longer exploration? So tell us a little bit more about how you're thinking about the road ahead.
Sure, definitely. I mean, when I started out on this book, I was primarily focused on Kautilya. again, the thinking was on the Madison data set, there had to be a framework, economic framework. Intuitively, that's what I felt. And I analyzed the Arthashastra. But more and more as I research, I realize that this is an ocean in the sense that not only is the, during Kautilya's time, even pre-Kautilya and post-Kautilya. So that there are, areas of research that can be done on how these civilizations function. In fact, my next sort of sequel to this book is to see how common era kingdoms, which is, the Chola, Chera, Pandya kingdoms, Vijayanagar Empire, and even the kingdoms in Cambodia, a lot of them have references to the Arthashastra, for example. So a lot of these sort of civilizational entities have similar sort of principles. So how do these principles evolve? Meaning they could have altered this framework, gone to a different framework as time passed. And how these sort of evolved over their time. So that's another area of research which I think is very interesting. But eventually, I think the goal is to try to understand how some of these lessons of the past could be used, today.
At some point when it becomes history, I'm sure Sriram will look at Modinomics as well. So Bala's. Bala, on that point though, your thoughts on connecting this, this thesis of Dharmic capitalism to what you see the Modi regime doing. I mean, Bala has been quite modest. He's one of the most astute capital market thinkers and has been instrumental in unleashing the mutual fund industry through his contributions to the AMFI. So Bala, it will be helpful to understand your read on this relevance of Dharmic capitalism in today's day and age and what you see Modinomics sort of helping drive that.
See, first and foremost, which I connected with the book and what is currently being driven, is social welfare. I think the biggest thing which I think is being changed is it's given a structure, there is a market, there is the policymakers and so on and so forth. I think clearly I'm able to relate to that, the way the federal system got changed since the time Modi became Prime Minister. Which is nothing but no state should come to me with a begging ball in case there is a due from the central government. And I'll give the money as it's become due to you. And you go and do actual development activity. Therefore, this empowering the respective states with the right policy, with the right framework of operating model, and basis which each state has to compete with each other for the prosperity of the country. That is the first and foremost thing which I see as the direct connect. Because Chanakya Sastra is actually the whole, a single concept of the whole country as a whole, Bharat. Of course, extending to the other countries as well. But the fact of the matter is not just residing only in India, is going outside. I think you mentioned about Chola regime, Chera regime. The Chola regime is not restricted only southern parts of India. It's actually gone even beyond southern parts of India. That's something I see as principles. Second is, anything that is being done, it has to have sustainability attached to it. You cannot be just doing actually for 1 year or 2 years. It has to be for a multi-generation kind of model. So that's something again I'm able to see it, because anything that is being done, with the government being the largest spender, so everything that is being done actually is being created for the purpose of sustainability of the economy, sustainability of the welfare, wealth creation, and so on and so forth. Wealth creation today, as you rightly said, just about 10 years back, wealth creation was considered as something is non-dharmic types. I think anything stock market means, people generally used to hate it, it's speculative. Today, no more it is there. Even the hard-earned money of the investors, which is basically the EPF I am talking about, has been permitted to invest in equity, knowing very well equity is risky, but at the same time, it's not risky if you have to look at the longer term. Therefore, sustainability becomes a question mark. I think survival is a question mark. I think some of the global nations have gone through the pain period of not managing their pension plans very efficiently. Today, they are all going through a pain period. Because they know actually that Australia recently has gone through a pain period, US is going through a pain period. Whereas India's own model, without taking the name of pension plan, but we have beautiful social security systems, which again Government of India has re-emphasized under the current Modinomics to ensure that the economic build actually on a sustainable basis. And finally, there is of course reference is also given in the book, is the ease of trading. I was wondering, in the non-digital world, in the early days, how the ease of trading ease of doing business would have been addressed. I'm not, of course, it will be interesting if Sriram can answer that. The fact of the matter is that today all of us are talking about ease of doing business because of the digital, but there is an element of policy which is becoming more and more robust. And that something is being seen as, which is seen as an obstacle. That obstacle is being removed in order to ensure the business growth is made more seamless. That's something again I see as a big thing. The last but not the least with respect to the current Modinomics is not actually Modinomics alone. Even the government initiative just ensure that every person who borrows from the banks has to pay back. I think since you are also part of the finance company, today each one of us sitting in this room have got a score for us. We may not know about it, which is CIBIL score I call it. All of us sitting in the room who are spending money through the credit card, there is somebody is capturing your credit, not underwriting model, but credit assessment model. Somebody is already doing it. There is a system is doing it. And because nobody can escape from these systems, therefore, since the time the IBC, which is Insolvency Banking, the act that came, there is a fear factor of not paying the money. If you don't pay, there is a fear that your business will go away. I think there are many businesses who are built with a great difficulty out of borrowed money. The moment it becomes a problem, actually you think that asset belongs to the bank. If you don't get in trouble, asset belongs to you. So that is the way I think business was built. It completely got changed the last few years because of having the right people with the right policy framework and the right attitude to drive things to the final core implementation. That's something I am able to relate to what he just mentioned, what is written in the book. To IBC. IBC has become such a powerful animal that anybody who looks at India as one of the country, they think the banking financial service actually is the barometer to measure the success of the economy. Today we can say with a lot of pride that Indian banking system is actually far more better than what you have seen maybe just about 6 years back. So that's the way I'm able to relate it. At the end of the day, when I look at it, looking at the social welfare, building the infrastructures, including water management, today I just mentioned in my opening remark, all of them are actually more intended towards building sustainable economy of the future rather than doing it for the current, the needs. That I was wondering how did you pick up this ease of doing business was also one of the thought process of Chanakya Sastra, especially in the world, which of course everything was being done and whichever way it was being worked out and where from it picked up. But also I had another question. I think you made so much of reference to Rig Vedas, to various things. I was wondering how did you go about picking those insight and bring it as part of the your relationship to the book.
Yeah, thank you. So let me answer it in two parts. So the first one is on ease of business. I think that again relates to the fundamental point that I'm bringing, that eventually any sort of economic activity is based on choices that individuals make, consumer choices. So it could be as a collective, all of us together in this room, if we make a consumer choice, then that sort of aggregates to what we call the macroeconomy, right? So no matter what time in history you are, we are still human beings to make these choices. So you still have behavioral instincts, you still have, these kind of instincts to make these choices. So whether you're a policymaker now or 2,000 years later or 3,000 years later, as long as we are human beings, you still have to be cognizant of some of these ideas. So I think the idea of ease of business is again something similar. Kautilya was very clear that he wanted an environment where businesses can flourish, which means even in those times, say you have ships and you have products coming, spices being traded between the Middle East and say Bharat at that time, you still need to have mechanisms where the person who's trading these products needs to be happy at some level in terms of how the business environment is. So I think at a conceptual level, the underpinning is similar. How do you sort of make someone who's running a business not feel suffocated, targeted, and there is an ease, confidence in the system? So that's where Kautilya's idea of a rule enforcing state comes from. Not just because he wants to sort of control everyone. It is because he believed that if there is a state which is believing in rule of law and order, then businesses are far more confident. There's resolution which is far more confident. In fact, Kautilya mentions that if there is a business dispute between a small business owner and say a much bigger player, then there needs to be a sort of a mechanism, something like an NCLT, for example, right, which facilitates that discussion or that sort of legal discussion between the two people in a fair and transparent manner, so that there is confidence in the system. So, for example, he gave a lot of exemptions to imports. So people who are importing goods, they were provided additional exemptions. They were provided tax breaks in some cases. Transportation from one place to another. because the Chanakya kingdom almost spanned from, say, Gandhara, which is Afghanistan today, all the way till south of India. So, in terms of transporting all these goods and services, so he provided additional support to businesses to enable that this was done in a safe and regulated manner. So, in that sense, in those times, these were the ways that he could sort of do to ease the business. But I think, principles, the way it's implemented has changed today because of a variety of factors. But the primary sort of philosophical thinking was to sort of make it, enhance the ease of business. On the point on, on the point on the scriptures and the early chapters, that is a conscious attempt. If you look at the book, the first chapter sort of goes back. The argument is that a lot of Kautilya's ideas were there in the Ramayana, Mahabharata, in Rigveda, Yajurveda. I also make references like what Bala mentioned on Rudram and Chamakam, because we view all of these, as spiritual scriptures. I chant the Rudram, I chant the Chamakam. But there is also an underpinning of a way of life even there. That was a sort of a collaboration which I did with Professor Satish Deodar, who's I am Ahmedabad. In fact, the credit should go to him because he sort of gave me the insight and the background also. And then we collaborated. So what we did was we looked at some of these scriptures. So he provided sort of a template. And then we looked at some of these scriptures and looked at some of these sort of day-to-day activities that were mentioned in these scriptures and how they could relate to conventional economic ideas. So going from the spiritual to the conventional is what generally you do the other way around. But for the purposes of this book, we sort of made an attempt to go the other way. But I think I'm glad it resonated with you, sir. So that's very good to know.
Yeah, but I want to stir the pot a little bit on this ease of doing business. Yeah. So, if you look back at the evolution of economics, which you have as part of Madison's data set analysis and so forth, but you can't divorce economics from the politics. Right? And globally, over that same 2000-year period, we've gone from being sort of monarchies or theocracies at different points in time to fascism at one period to maybe socialism, communism for a period to now it looks like the accepted political model is liberal democracy. And India is clearly the youngest, largest, and I'd argue the most impressive liberal democracy in the world today. There's also a lot of chest thumping going on about this 5 trillion, 7.5 trillion, 10 trillion and so forth, which is fantastic. But reality for all of us that do business is there are rules and there are rules and there are even more rules, right? Several thousand compliances that we have to deal with, inspections and supervisions and, sign-offs that we have to do on a daily, weekly, monthly, fortnightly basis. So while this ease of doing business is all fine and dandy and it used to exist, but in today's context of a hungry superpower that wants to unleash, it looks like our political journey and the consequences of those choices. And by the way, I think we are the only country in the world where capitalism succeeded democracy as a choice. I don't think any other country has had that. Everywhere it was either a theocracy or a monarchy or a fascist when the capitalist choice was made or the choice around capitalism was made. It creates a lot of complications, right? Because we're boxed and we get dragged down when we want to be unshackled and we want to prosper. So both to Bala and you, I'd love to hear your thoughts. It seems to me, we are on the path of dharmic capitalism for sure, as I look at the next 15, 20 years. But it also seems to me that it's going to be a very tough journey. We are 5th largest economy in the world. On PPP terms, we're probably number 3 or number 4. We are the largest rice producer, largest milk producer, 5th largest defense spender in the world. So on many material artha matters, we are actually top of the league. But I contrast that with what I see on many of the social, civic infrastructure and sort of socio-economic factors. Maternal mortality, infant mortality amongst the bottom quartile in the world. Human Development Index, 138 or 140th. Women's Empowerment Index, we are 150th. Now, some of these surveys, there's ongoing debate now on methodology and so forth. But even if I set that aside, we're still, instead of the top 10, we're in the bottom 100, let's say. Still not a great place to be. So it looks like we'll have to go through some challenges before things get better to me. So how does these notions of dharmic capitalism, corruption, by the way, let's not get started, right? Although a lot has improved, this notion of ethical, harmonious living is very hard, no? Just yesterday, one of my colleagues was describing that, there was a corporation bus that came and knocked his car at a traffic light. And so I said, what's the big deal? You just, file an FIR, get the insurance company to pay and you'll get paid. But the FIR filing process was a torture because apparently the bus driver pretended to faint right there, right? And an ambulance was bought, he got on the ambulance and he went. So this chap goes to the police station to file an FIR. The police guy says, brake failure, sir. Write brake failure in the FIR. There's no brake failure, boss. He came and hit me because the bus had been transported to the police station by then. If brakes had failed, how do you transport the bus? No, sir, brake failure in anything. Please write brake failure. So I'm saying there's still all this, we can talk about harmonious living and so forth, but it looks like we have lots of challenges, right? So how do we deal with those challenges? Something I'd love for certainly the younger generation, but also the thinkers in the room to be provoked into maybe applying their minds and guiding us. What are your thoughts?
The way I see is, I think we are in a transformation stage. While of course what you're saying, to some extent, yes, that's the reality. And we cannot escape from the reality. But the fact of the matter is, you bring in right of regulations. I come from industry, which is heavily regulated, and responsibility on all of us is extremely high. The number of commitment, that sign off that we do, and it can actually put us into trouble in case any deviation happens. That means there is an element of accountability, responsibility, there is an element of faith also has to be there. And all the three have to go hand in hand, otherwise no system can function. And second is, the way the policy making is being done is actually being pushed to the rule based, and then you follow the rules. If you cannot just move away from the business. I think a simple example I see is the way the single tax structure has been introduced in the country, which is GST. And in my own personal belief is the most powerful reforms that India has implemented. And especially in a countries like vast country like us, Europe can take pride, US can take pride, but India, to make it successful, given the fact that we have an aspiring population, young population, we also have people not paying back the money considered as dharma in the country, right? We also have systems where if you cheat somebody is considered as dharma, if you don't pay back the money is considered as dharma, right? We have a different connotation which we have lived all these years. Now that is undergoing a change. That means the next generation, I think, will all start following, understanding these things. But as everything comes after the systems driven, the probability of all these things getting caught is also equally high. I think today the systems that get developed so much, and with the data analytics is coming in, definitely I think India is progressing very well as far as the digital economy concerns, which I think we are in the transformation stage. Maybe it will take some time. The second, which I think in my own belief is, which I think seems to be happening, the entrepreneurial nature of building the nation is actually growing each year. Just to give a simple example, the people who come out of the college, first he thinks about whether I can do any business on my own, rather than going and taking employment in any companies, given the fact that what employment I'll take, what salary will come, how will I grow my future needs and so on and so forth. There is a element of thinking which comes in the youngsters that can I run on more business, for which today the government of India has enabled funding being available. Since you mentioned about the examples of FIR, I was in Tirunamalai just about last week, and of course it's a real example. It's that a lady who mans the crematorium, so I've gone for some condolence. A lady who mans the crematorium, and of course cremation got over. And she was walking out carrying a nice bag in her, and then she dressed up very quickly. And then she's walking out nicely for a meeting. I asked the lady, I just asked. Then she said, sir, I'm a leader of a 20 women's group leader. I bring in 20 groups and help them get money from Indian Bank. At 10.60. That's why she said that 10.60 I get money for them, 1.5 lakh rupees. Then I went on to the extension of conversations. What is the rate of default in this? She said 0. Because an operating group, and she said the culture now is changing more towards paying back the money. On basis which he said, I am organizing money for helping people, for which I asked her, what is your remuneration for this? Then she gets commission from the money that is raised from the people who are recipients of this money. At the same time, government of India is giving about 500 rupees. Therefore, the total income for her monthly is about 5,000 rupees for managing the crematorium. Plus, she also gets money from these kind of organizing money. I said, how much money you have so far collected? About 2.5 crores she has done. That is the real India. So I am specifically mentioning about the real example. That's the real India. Was it happening before? Probably it would have happened in some parts of the country, not so much in detail. But today is happening so much in detail with the courage, with the deep understanding. That, in my view, is a change of the nation, which I think will take some time for it to start delivering the real power of Bharat.
Yeah, I'd just like to, segue from what Bala said. The gap between real India and, and Delhi's India, for example, that is a very distinct gap. I think a lot of people understand between the policy maker and the way of life, of how we live our lives, there is a definite gap. Often what happens is that the gap is, people sort of get attuned to these policies and at some point of time, get accustomed to it, the gap gets filled, right? The argument of Kautilya is that it should be the other way around. In the sense, there is a way of life, you construct policy and policy making to suit that way of life so that efficiency of policy is much higher. So I'll give you an example. So let's take the sovereign gold scheme, which the RBI, has sort of enlisted in the last few years. When the first version of the scheme came, it really did not take off. So there was a survey done by academics on why this scheme didn't work out. So the single biggest reason why they gave was that when women deposited their gold, they wanted the same gold back after maturity, after 3 years, right? So they wanted the same gold back after maturity after 3 years, which is basically one cultural quality and that cultural aspect of where we live influences the effectiveness of policy. So RBI in subsequent sort of iterations of this scheme started making modifications that can sort of suit this sort of phenomenon. So what I'm trying to say is that there is definitely a gap between the policymaker's intent and the way of life in general. How do you sort of mitigate this gap is to look at some of these new principles or old principles which are used to sort of mitigate this gap. I think that is an attempt, that we need to sort of look. I mean, on a day-to-day level, I agree. All these things look, sort of utopian in one sense. But I think a strong civilization is something which is confident, which means you need to have a better understanding of your past to sort of learn from it. I think we are in a transition phase, like what Bala mentioned. I think these ups and downs will come, but at a really sort of big picture level, I feel these type of research and undertakings would sort of help us to sort of narrow this gap a bit more and take us into a more sustainable level, in my view.
Yeah, no, that's probably fair, right? But unless all of us get involved and engaged, I don't think change is going to happen, right? I mean, it's not clear that some policymaker sitting in Delhi or Bombay or wherever will give the policy, or Chennai's ribbon buildings will give us, and magically change will happen, right? We have to get involved, and I don't know how we trigger that, and maybe, as Bala was saying, next generation will make it happen. The one thing from the book that I found interesting was there's a couple of tables from the Arthashastra on compensation, for example, right? And so I'm just going to read from here. The grade A, which is the higher grades in the kingdom, the king's guru, crown prince, king's mother, queen, councillors and civil service, chief of defense. You can think of these as key management personnel in an organization, right? Their compensation was 48,000 pannas. Pannas is the right way to say it, do you think?
That's right, yeah.
Pannas, okay? And then the guys down below, so palace actors, occasional secret service agents, accountants, clerks, things like that, which is, people at the front line, so to speak. They're anywhere from 250 to 500 pannas. So the ratio is somewhere in the range of 1 to 50 to 1 to 100. And there's a lot today that gets disclosed, and folks like Anand, who write in the business line quite regularly on governance, will relate to this, that, there's too much compensation for senior executives, whereas Arthashastra seems to, have codified, endorsed 50 times to 100 times, right? That's one observation. The second, perhaps more pertinent observation for us to think about is fines. Because one of the things in the Arthashastras, there are how you lead life, and then when you violate those rules, there are consequences. And I found these fines, for example, on property law violations. And I'll just give a couple of examples, quite fascinating. So, obstruction to roads leading to provincial headquarters is 1,000 panas. That's almost like a month's salary or 2 months' salary, 3 months' salary of lower level people. And I'm just thinking, what would have happened when these farm bill protesters that were, clogging the roads and the highways into Delhi, hundreds of thousands of them, many of them rich farmers with, massage parlors and pizzas delivered to them right there, blockaded our national capital for months on end. If we had these kind of fines, right? And it seems to me, you get away with a 50 rupee or a 100 rupee fine when you don't wear a helmet. Whereas if we were true to our roots, shouldn't our fines for violations of rules be substantial? And you go to Singapore, and you violate stuff, or you go to the US and you overspeed, they're ruthless, no? Yet we glorify Singapore and glorify, the US. Whereas in India, if you put a fine, suddenly, the state is evil. Your annadata, you're trying to exploit. Seems bogus, no?
No, the thing is, the implementation is the key, right? So if there is a particular fine, whether people sort of go through the process to ensure that without the due diligence is done and eventually the fine is paid on time is also an important point. I agree. There are lots of these sort of anecdotes in the book which gives you tables and descriptions of all this. But one point I want to also add is that Kautilya himself says that all that he says doesn't necessarily need to be right. He himself says it's a sort of an iterative exercise. So, there could be many things which are outdated today, and there could be things which are relevant today. So it's upon us to sort of figure out what are the relevant things and how those relevant things can be used. But I think this is one of those examples where, for example, the proportionality of these fines, which Kautilya gives, is not, it could be disproportional in some cases. And in some cases, it could be proportional. So on the point of salaries, for example, I think another interesting thing is he has a very detailed state, in the sense you exactly know for which type of government servants, for example, what type of these salaries are, etc., etc. But that doesn't necessarily mean that he sort of what do I call, intervene on how you do day-to-day activities. So, for example, if Rajiv and myself, we are trading, say, goods between us, I am selling him soap and he gets, say, 1,000 cartons of soap. Kautilya doesn't tell you how many quantities that he or me can trade. He doesn't micromanage at that level. He might give us regulations. He might give us, fines for regulations if you don't follow them, and he might even give you the most stringent sort of punishment. But he doesn't tell you how you run your day-to-day life. I think that is an important also element which we need to sort of decipher. But yeah.
Okay, so on the 2 points that Mr. Lochan brought up on the Human Development Index and women's empowerment, there's so many absurdities in the original text of Kautilya's Arthashastra, where he talks about don't trust women, things like you must have known. Okay. One reading will give you so many absurdities in it. He endorses the Varna system and all that. So I'm just wondering, the dharmic capitalism that you kind of got out of the text, I'm just wondering, is that the reason why the Mauryan Empire didn't do very well at the end? And perhaps we should probably have a rethink on, the real validity of the text itself, in today's times. It's so easy to just say, what you just said, but I'm saying how relevant. I mean, what is the proof of the pudding in the real sense of the implementation of the policies of Kautilya?
You take it, and then I have definitely things to say. So
Okay,
please.
Yeah, definitely there are, there are things. No, there are definitely things which are, which are not acceptable. He has controversial statements on a lot of things that you mentioned. But this book is primarily on his sort of philosophical worldview on the economy. If I went into those subjects, I could have further, probably looked into all this. But there are research material or people have written about this. So I do agree that again, my argument is not that Kautilya is God or a demigod. Kautilya is as flawed as you or I am. It's just that he happened to have a set of ideas, and his kingdom or the kingdom that he advised did reasonably well for them to dominate vast areas of land. And anecdotes of travelers, if you forget about what Indians say, if you look at Chinese embassy notes, if you look at what the Greeks say, if you look at what some of the Middle Eastern traders, their accounts, the Periplus of the Erythraean Sea, that's another very important book which everyone has to read, especially students. All of them, indicate that this was a prosperous land. In the sense, there was prosperity in this land, and this land was a sort of a world beater in terms of prosperity, which meant this was a sort of a central place for the rest of the world's commerce. For example, I'll just give you an example. There are accounts by embassy notes which says that the Roman fiscal deficit and the current account deficit were impacted by the manufacturing of coins and spices and all these things in Bharat. Though there was a lag, meaning it had to be shipped and all these things, what I'm trying to say is that the products that were exported and imported from these countries had an important say in the finances of countries far away from India. So what I'm trying to say is that there is definitely an era of prosperity, and Kautilya was part of that era. And there's a text which sort of reflected that era. So I sort of focused on that part of it. But I do agree that, not all his ideas are A, relevant, B, are considered, proper in today's terms. So there are controversial areas, no doubt. But this book sort of stays away from that because it focuses on purely the financial/economics.
I must say I'm not quite as gracious, if you will, as Sriram here is. See, I think we've got to look at things in the context in which they were written, right? So again, with great deal of respect, you use the word absurdities. In today's context, those might seem absurd. And you've got to read it in that context. Again, as a point of fact for some of the younger folks in the audience, till the 60s, some of the most respected democracies in the world, women didn't have the right to vote. I mean, what bigger absurdity is there in contemporary times that 50, 60 years ago, women didn't have the right to vote in Switzerland, in the United States, in many parts of Anglo-Saxon world, who are the harbingers and the glorified, upholders of liberal democracy. Women didn't have a right to vote. And so let's not go back, a couple thousand years and then, what was characterized appropriate then, and draw something here. That's one observation. Second observation I want to make is, what do we do today? Given today's context, what can we take away is something that's worth sort of debating and discussing and figuring out so that we can move forward. And it seems to me there are choices each of us as individuals have to make as we look at economic prosperity on the one hand and social it's actually, we should be paranoid socially where we are as a country, right? This dichotomy is actually quite scary. And how we as responsible citizens and responsible future sort of upholders of this democracy, the younger folks at the back, how we shepherd the country is going to be quite critical, and what we can ensure that, the proof of the pudding that you sought is the fact that we're all around here today. We are reclaiming the past glory, which until 400 years ago we were a fourth to a third of the world GDP. Today we are whatever 6-7%, right? So it got frittered away because we didn't adapt. Yet we are here. We are respected. We are shapers of world policy now. So to me, that's the proof of the pudding. And the dynasty went away just means that dynasties will go. Much like, if you look at businesses, after the third or the fourth generation, businesses tend to sort of sunset, right? And so there's a very natural process by which, prosperity breeds incompetence, breeds sort of eradication, so to speak, right? And so how a society rejuvenates and renews itself is, I think, quite important. And what at least our civilization has shown in the last few thousand years is that we've had the opportunity to renew despite being ravaged, right, and pillaged and plundered for the last several hundred years, right? We've been looted. And yet we are here sitting with grace, with dignity, with tolerance, with openness, having a very mature dialogue. That to me is the strength of the civilization, right? And that to me is where some of these texts we got to distill out and take. I'd love to chat with you offline, but let me stop. And I saw a couple more hands, so please feel free to. Sir, you had raised your hand. So I saw his hand first, so we'll go there and then we'll come to the gentleman in the back. Can we get him a mic? Oh, you already grabbed a mic. Okay. Sorry, he's already grabbed it. Please go ahead. Let the early bird wins the worm. So go for it.
No, I have three quick questions. You're talking about dharmic capitalism. We are also in a scenario where if there is retrenchment happening, it is the employees who get impacted by business across, whether it is Twitter or in the case of Baiju in India and other startups. What is that relevance to that of dharmic capitalism with respect to corporation? The second point is regarding the legal system, which is quite important. I don't know how far it is covered in the book. Unless the laws are strong and the contracts are enforced, it is very difficult for any business to run, and also people don't have much of a fear. And the third point, which I just want to quote former TNC agent who said that, what does a person in the planning commission in Delhi know how to grow coconuts in Kerala? Okay. What is that? Chanakya has talked about decentralization of powers. It is not the states, it's a panchayat which needs to govern, which is with respect to Chola system, also with respect to water management. I just need to have the views. Thanks.
Before you answer, I'm told we'll take his question as well and then address both.
Namaste. Thanks, Sriram. I actually hosted Sriram for a conversation a couple of weeks back on the book itself. I've read it fully. I'd like to ask one question and also one observation on the conversation that was just said, that you just had. I think we should be careful, and I'm glad you pushed back in some sense. In the sense that if you're looking for a comparison, maybe we should compare the Kautilyanomics Smriti of that particular time with the Justinian system, for instance, just to give you an example. And then we would see how the Kautilyanomics Smriti was actually ahead of the Justinian system when it comes to the rights of women, so to speak, right? So I think the point that you made of comparing in context, if at all comparison is to be made, is wonderful. To Sriram, I think I'd like to understand a little bit about the multiple texts, right? When you said you spoke with different, because there are students over here who are much younger. Maybe if you could detail that process out a little bit more, in terms of timelines and how did you go about reaching out to different scholars? I know a bit of it, but it's rare to have youngsters in the audience. So I'd like to kind of take this opportunity for you to flesh that out.
Sure. So let me try to answer these questions. So firstly, right, on what Rajiv was mentioning, I also agree with what Meg said. I think it has to be a contextual sort of comparison. I think if you look at it that way, Kautilya seems to be ahead compared to his contemporaries at that time. On this particular point related to civilizational understanding, I think that's important because that reflects the confidence of a society, right? a society, because if you're looking at, say, Atmanirbharta and a Bharat, say, into 2047, which is going to sort of be one of the superpowers of the world in 2050 onwards, you need innovative new ideas. You need ideas which can relate and which people can, which can be ahead of its time. For example, the UPI itself, right? The UPI, I think, is ahead of the rest of the world in terms of an infrastructure, in terms of a technology. So that sort of a mind frame doesn't come from a weak civilizational understanding. It comes from a society which understands its past really well and then works on that and then evolves itself. So I think that civilizational understanding is very important. I think that reflects a confidence in society, and that's why this is important. So on this point related to contracts, which you had mentioned on, say, Twitter, or Kautilya mentions about the importance of labor contracts. In fact, he even says, there's in the book which I mentioned, that between the low wage laborers, the daily wage laborers that we talk about, and the employer, he sort of says that there has to be a contractual arrangement between both of them. We don't even have that today. So, for example, if there's a daily wage laborer, he or she does not have a contractual arrangement with the person. It's you just give them daily wages and then they move on. Kautilya says there needs to be a contract. There needs to be a defined engagement between what they have to do or what they can do and for what number of time or how long the time is. And if they're laid off for some reason, you have to sort of inform them before. So the concept of protection for the real, lower end of the spectrum in terms of economic value is given by Kautilya, so that the poor is sort of empowered in this context. So I think he has thought about some of these ideas before in terms of labor contracts. There is actually a chapter which deals with this. And on the legalities, I agree. That's a very complex structure. I mean, today's legal system is a maze by itself. But Kautilya does have principles on how legal matters can be resolved, and he has, which I've again described in the book. So that's an area where I think there is far more scope for development, because there are lots of sort of legal principles in the Arthashastra itself, based on law and order, and those principles are, I'm not a lawyer, so that is an area of research by itself. On decentralization, that's a very important point. Society was highly decentralized. I mean, in the sense that, I'll give you an example. There was a statistical institute. I mean, Kautilya had these, because for Kautilya to understand, say, the price points in society, he had to have some sort of surveys done at least at an informal level in all the villages for him to have an understanding of those price points. So there were statistical institutes or people as part of these institutes who used to go to individual houses to sort of survey people on the price points of various goods and services. And all of these institutes were all based in villages, in a highly decentralized manner, so that all of this information would aggregate to a central repository, but that would obviously come with a lag. So a lot of the governance was done at the decentralized level. I'm not even going into the role of a temple as a financial / economic institutions besides a religious institution. So that's probably another book by itself. But for the sovereign state, he believed that a lot of it needs to be decentralized, purely because of convenience and also because of the lag, in terms of governance. Because if there's an issue at the grassroots level, today it's instantaneous because we have technology and all these things. In Kautilya's times, obviously it would take a long time for someone at the central level to sort of understand the issue. So you're right. So a lot of decentralization was there during his time. And the growth of things like Panchayati Raj and all these things were part of, that ecosystem. On Meg's point, thank you. So, yeah, the role of multiple texts is an important point, right? Dealing with these kind of scriptures, the first point is skepticism. Because everyone is going to tell you, what's the point of doing this? What are you going to gain out of this? What are you going to do all this? So, for young people, I think you need to sort of move away from that mindset. I'll give you an example, right? Often, people say Shama Sastri discovered this text in 1915. I mean, that was a book, the Arthashastra book, which the main translation. But there's a backstory to this. There's a Vedic Pandit who went from Tanjavur all the way to Mysore Oriental Library to give this manuscript during British time. he did not have any incentive to do this. He went and gave this manuscript to Shama Shastri, who was a librarian at Mysore Oriental Library. So prior to this, for 1,000 years, this country did not know where the manuscript of the Arthashastra was. Right? If this Pandit for some reason did not give this manuscript, people heard about what Chanakya was by folklore, meaning different people from different generations actually pass on the message. But the actual manuscript was found by this gentleman, and he had gone all the way to Mysore to deposit in that library. So, and that is how the Arthashastra is today. And in fact, that manuscript is being protected now at the library. And what I'm trying to say is that if that gentleman had thought about all these reasons, ifs and buts, we wouldn't see the text today. I think that's how students need to approach this type of subjects. You do these subjects for a sort of a passional objective. You need to view it as as a stamp in history. It might not be a stamp in history, but it might trigger a sequence of thoughts and ideas which can sort of take you forward. So that skepticism, I think, needs to be overcome. Second point is, all these different texts have different sort of dynamics in terms of the language, in terms of the density of this text, the prose of the text. So the subject matter experts is very important. I think engaging with experts who worked on these texts will help individuals to sort of gain more knowledge. And I think for students, lastly, I think why this is important is when they are going to say college, or when they're going to be in their 50s, India, for all you know, might be a superpower, right? And it's likely to be. So, the ability to sort of correlate, sort of bring these ideas to the table, which could be innovative for the rest of the world, is a very important sort of soft power that we have. I think that we should use. So
as he climbs up the steps, that means time is up. But I do want to take a minute, sir, with your permission, to address, I think, one important point the gentleman in the back brought up, which is, Byju's letting people go, and how does that fit with dharmic capitalism? There are 2 points in dharmic capitalism, at least the way he's argued, that resonate with me. One is, you've got to have an ethical, harmonious approach to doing what you're doing. And second, you've got to think about life from a sustainable growth standpoint. And it seems to me this whole startup ecosystem needs to get both of those. They have to think about it and get it right. You can't blitzscale, hypergrow, and ensure that will sustain. You can't moonlight, do double, triple jobs, chase valuation without focusing on consumer, who is the king. So some of these, I think there are breaches all around, right? Employees took advantage of the bonanza. The promoters and the entrepreneurs took advantage of the Kool-Aid that was given to them by, money that was printed in large doses. Really, after a while, that has to come, and it will, come back home to bite you, That's what we're beginning to see. We've got to take literally a 50, 100-year view to these things, right? Even what you're seeing with the Googles and the Metas of the world, it's only a small 25-year view that they've had, right? And we've already written books and chapters with someone who's only 25 years old. I think we've got to see the story over a few decades, if not a few centuries, before we can draw some of these conclusions. Right? So that's just the thought that I'll leave with you.
Could you speak something on the taxation aspect as far as agriculture was concerned?
Can you repeat that one just for?
Is there anything on the taxation as far as agriculture is concerned?
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, that is one thing. And two, on meeting social welfare objectives versus the economy. Is there anything on that aspect also? And thirdly, on the issue of women, Kautilyanomics talks about the concept called as Paraspara Dveshana Moksha, which means mutual separation. Way back in the 3rd century BC, he talks about mutual separation, which was not there in other parts of the world. So I think talking about women's rights, he says women had a right of going in for a divorce.
Yeah, thank you. So you're right. Let me also make this additional point. The Arthashastra text is context agnostic, which I mean, what I mean is that it's a text written not as a template for the Mauryan Empire. It's a text written, probably Kautilya understood the constraints of governance, and then he probably understood politicians would take away a lot of his ideas. So he decided to put one text on his own. And then, and then he said, you pick and choose whatever you want from this. This is my set of ideas, right? on your point related to taxation, yeah. So definitely there is. See, Kautilya's taxation levels are between 16 to 25%, right? What we define as ideal sort of taxation is what Kautilya had in mind. 1/6 of is general principle. But he also argued for taxation agriculture. So he said that was something that needs to be done. But again, he set a list of taxes. It's up to the state, the governing state, to sort of pick and choose them. But the range of them is what you need to see, and the conceptual underpinning is what you need to see. And the last point I want to mention is, again, the importance, which is not directly related to the subject, but again, you take the idea of, say, international trade. Like when I studied school in PSBB and all these places, I never understood or came to terms with the fact that this was a Bharatiya phenomenon, right? I was told that pre-1990, post-1990, India opened up, and that's when all these things came to play. But the reality is that the period from 1947 or 47 to 90 is the exception. The norm in this place has been, connecting with the rest of the world, whether it is pre-Kautilya, post-Kautilya. The norm in this place has been engaging with the rest of the world and showing leadership to the rest of the world, whether it's economics, politics, or ideas. I think that is the fundamental underpinning for a lot of the students and people here. When you start studying these subjects, you come to terms with these facts that you never learn in school. And the more you come to terms with these facts, the more you're self-confident by yourself, by where you come from. And I think that's a very good springboard for future ideas and new innovative things.
So all things, as they say, must come to an end, and we can carry on this discussion. For me, Kautilya, the quintessential bureaucrat advising the government, I think it's very fascinating to hear many of the views, and we will carry forward the discussion. Well, it was a set of engagement, rules of engagement, where the king had a set of rules for the people, but the rules did not apply to them. That was essentially Kautilya. So a very strong set of rules for everything and a strong enforcement of the rules. And I think many of the points which came out in the discussion was that mainly it was the lack of implementation or the lack of enforcement. That is the problem, and not the rules in themselves. So we'll take this discussion forward, and I must thank first and foremost the students from PSBB who have joined us, and we need more and more participation from the younger generation, so that you are the ones who are going to carry this legacy forward. So thanks to all of you for being patient and listening and making sense of some very esoteric concepts which are being discussed. My thanks to Rajiv for wonderful moderation of the session. And Bala unfortunately had to leave, but we will convey our thanks to him personally. And he made some very good points connecting the past with the present. We must thank him for that. And of course, Sriram, your efforts in the form of all this research, it needs to be done. One thing which is happening in our country is we are interpreting our own history, our own culture through the lens of others, because we did not have the scholarship to go into all these original texts. We base ourselves on the translations. One simple example is the French Institute in Pondicherry is the World Resource Center for the Agama Shastras of our country. Right? They have that scholarship and they have that branding, whether no other institution in the country has such. I think we need more and more original studies. We need more and more authors like Sriram to go into our original texts and bring it out from the lens of Indians. And so there may be points of view which you may agree or not agree, but we do need to bring this to the public forum. We need to put it up front and we need to discuss them openly. So thank you very much, Sriram, for this, and we hope to have you again sometime with your next book. All the best for that. And to some housekeeping matters, the next program of ours is on another very interesting topic, which is languages and the Indian Constitution. It's a very interesting topic, especially with the background of Tamil Nadu, and also the demands of many states for including their own languages into the constitutional in the schedules. So it is going to be an interesting discussion. We have a linguist, we have also some legal experts coming in. So we hope to see you all then. This is the 3rd of December. So see you on 3rd of December. Thank you very much for attending today.